Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tychos. The BBC Business headline from December 23rd announced, quote, UK economy had zero growth between July and September. This comes as the new Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer struggles with a plunge in popularity, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, wrestles with an almost unmanageable budget, posting deficits of almost 6% of GDP, struggling to find cuts, each one more unpopular than the last. At the same time, a large British retailer just forecast that, quote, UK growth is likely to slow as employer tax increases and their potential impact on prices and employment begin to filter through the economy, end quote. All as a result of Reeves' budget. One recent headline blared out, Rachel Reeves could not have done worse than this, while another asked rhetorically, is Rachel Reeves a bad chancellor? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But frankly, neither party has even the slightest chance of making a meaningful, durable dent in the deficit. The UK's unfortunate, problematic situation is quite similar to the one in France, which we discussed last month. Slow growth, huge deficits, which in the UK have been in this range of 5 to 6% of GDP, and political vitriol. The situation has prompted conservatives to make the inevitable calls for budget cuts as the solution, with the long-standing logic that if we just get the government to behave, the private sector will be unleashed and thrive. It's a well-established but false idea. To understand that, all we have to do is go back to the basics, where we see that the GDP formula is very simply consumption plus investment plus government spending plus the trade balance equals GDP. GDP is, in essence, simply a measure of total spending. So how does GDP grow? Simple. It is growth in private sector spending plus growth in public sector spending plus an improvement in the trade balance. If you follow the reported numbers carefully, you'll quickly see that private sector spending comes from growth in private sector debt, as when you take out a mortgage to buy a new house or a company borrows to build a new factory. In the same way, public sector spending growth comes from public sector debt growth, as when government borrows to build a new highway. And of course, when we have a trade deficit, that is subtracted from GDP. So GDP growth comes from private sector debt growth, plus public sector debt growth, plus any net improvement in the trade balance. It's pretty much that straightforward. In the UK, two of those three things are going the wrong way. Private sector loans are stagnant, as we see in this chart comparing the UK's private sector loan growth to the US and France. It woefully lags US loan growth. And without private debt growth, they aren't going to see private sector GDP growth. The trade story is also discouraging. The UK hasn't had significant trade surplus since the 1980s, and it is now negative. With Brexit, if anything, I'm surprised the trade balance is not worse. Given how small the UK is, it has very little trade negotiating leverage, and no one is going to want to give it a great trade deal. So there's no reason to think that this will be a bright spot anytime soon. So the only real source of growth they have had has been government debt growth, not an enviable situation, nothing to write home about, but it's better than the alternative. But with growth only coming from one of the three sources, the result has been that the UK's growth has been modest and lackluster. So, given all that formula, suffice to say that if they cut government spending, it will only make the growth story worse, which is the catch-22 situation that virtually every major economy is now facing. Government spending growth, accompanied by rising deficits, is one choice, or lower growth, accompanied by lower deficits, is the other choice. It's the source of unending acrimony in Parliament and, frankly, in the halls of government everywhere in the Western world. What's the best way to get out of that trap of over-reliance on government debt growth? Simple: foster more robust private sector debt growth. GDP growth in the UK and France has lagged far behind that in the US, and the lower private debt growth pretty much sums up why. So how do you get productive private sector debt growth? Well, this is the hardest trick of all. In order to grow private sector debt productively, you have to have companies and projects with solid enough growth prospects to warrant or justify increasing lending. But the UK has had far too few of these. It's hard to build world-leading companies unless you have a large domestic market. That's why companies in the US and China are building all the dominant global companies. They have enough domestic customers to reach world-class operating scale, even if they are impeded from expanding into other countries. Britain effectively cut itself off from favorable access to the large pan-European markets with its Brexit policy. The population of Britain alone is small, only around 70 million, so it's going to have to pick its spots and specialize to succeed. That is a far, far cry from the glory days of the British Empire. But there is one area where the UK can boost private growth and private debt growth productively. It's the chronic housing shortage that is one of the biggest economic and social challenges that the UK faces. When it comes to economics, anytime you have a shortage of anything, that is fundamentally excellent news for growth prospects. An economy has to accelerate growth to fill that shortage. And housing is the largest sector of almost any economy, so addressing a housing shortage can easily be a big enough effort to boost an entire economy. An easy way to make this happen would be through some government-provided subsidy or tax credit so as to incent full involvement of the private sector housing industry. And you could couple that with an easing of regulatory restrictions and red tape to make it even more effective. In fact, the government is already aiming to build 1.5 million new homes, though barely 200,000 were built in 2023. That's far short of the almost 400,000 dwellings that need to be built annually over the next 5 years, according to calculations by Bloomberg News. Increasing home building to this level would be rocket fuel for the UK economy. However, with all the Sturm and Drang over the budget, it's not clear whether the UK will be aggressive enough to seize this all too ripe opportunity. So, expect the UK's slow growth and parliamentary invective to continue. That's it for this week.